Hello everyone, welcome back to Adira's Easy Talks. Today again I'm back with literary criticism and theory topic. So in this single video we are going to cover topic from module 30. And if you are watching my channel for the first time, please do share, subscribe and like my channel and hit the bell icon to get more updates from the channel. So without wasting much time, let's move on to today's topics. Aristotle's Poetics. Aristotle's Poetics is the earliest surviving work of Greek dramatic theory, and it is the first extant philosophical treatise to focus on literary theory. And he refers to poetry and more literally the poetic art. And Aristotle divides the art of poetry into number 1 verse drama, number 2 lyric poetry, and number 3 epic. The genres all shares the function of mimesis or imitation of life, but differ in three ways that Aristotle described. Number 1, differences in music rhythm, harmony, meter and melody. Number 2, difference of goodness in the characters. Number 3, difference in how the narrative is presented, that is telling a story or acting it out. The surviving book of Poetics is primarily concerned with drama. The analysis of tragedy constitutes the core of the discussion. Aristotle's major arguments primarily discourse on tragedy, epic poetry, and comedy as a chief form of imitative poetry. Number 2, definition of a tragedy and the rules for its construction, that is, the definition and analysis into qualitative parts. Number 3, rules for the construction of a tragedy. That is, tragic pleasure or catharsis experienced by fear and pity should be produced in the spectator. The characters must be good, appropriate, realistic, and consistent. Discovery must occur within the plot. Narratives, stories, structure, and poetics overlap. It is important for the poet to visualize all of the scenes when creating the plot. The poet should incorporate complication and denouement with the story, as well as combine all the elements of tragedy. The poet must express thought through the characters, words, and action while paying close attention to diction and how a character's spoken word expresses a specific idea. Aristotle believed that all of these different elements had to be present in order for the poetry to be well done. The next point is possible criticisms of an epic or tragedy and answers to them. The next is tragedy as artistically superior to epic poetry. That is, tragedy has everything that the epic has and even the epic meter being admissible. The reality of presentation is felt in the play as read as well as in the play as acted. The tragic imitation requires less time for the attainment of its end. If it has more concentrated effect, it is more pleasurable than one with a large admixture of time to dilute it. There is less unity in the imitation of the epic. Next work, An Apology for Poetry by Philip Sidney. So earlier this work, An Apology for Poetry, was known as the Defense of Poesy, and it was written in approximately 1580s and first published after the death of Philip Sidney, that is in 1595, and during that year it was twice published. And we know that this work, An Apology for Poetry, is a response to Stephen Gosson's The School of Abuse, which was published in 1595. In his essay, Sidney integrates a number of classical and Italian percepts on fiction. The essence of his defense is that poetry, by combining the liveliness of history with the ethical focus of philosophy, is more effective than either history or philosophy in rousing its readers to virtue. The work also offers important comments on Edmund Spenser and the Elizabethan stage. Sidney states that there have been three general kinds of poetry. Number 1, the chief being religious, which imitated the inconceivable excellence of God. The first kind is in his division of poetry, he talks about religious poetry, the first type. Then the second one is philosophical or informative poetry, And the third one is the imaginative or the right kind of poetry that Philip Sidney talks about. And also in this work, he talks about poetry as the cradle of civilization. It is a channel of divine power. And also he says that poetry can teach and delight, and it can surpass the virtue of history and philosophy. And also Sidney refutes 4 arguments leveled against poetry made by Stephen Gosson in his essay, The School of Abuse. The 4 arguments include: number 1, poetry is unprofitable. Number 2, poetry is the mother of lies. Number 3, poetry leads to sinful behavior. And number 4, Plato kicked the poets out of his republic. So these were the major 4 arguments that Stephen Gosson had put forth in his essay, The School of Abuse. The next work is Biographia Literaria by Coleridge. So it is a critical autobiography which was published in 1817 in 2 volumes, and its working title was Autobiographia Literaria. So in this work we can see the influence of William Wordsworth's theory of poetry, then Kantian view of imagination as a shaping power, for which Coleridge later coined the neologism exemplastic. Then various post-Kantian writers include F.W.J. von Schelling and the earlier influences of the empiricist school, then including David Hartley and the associationist psychology. The work is long and seemingly loosely structured, and although there are autobiographical elements, it is not a straightforward or linear autobiography. Its subtitle, Biographical Sketches of My Literary Life and Opinions, alludes to the life and opinions of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman, by Lawrence Sterne, suggesting that the formal qualities of the Biographia are intentional. The work was originally intended as a preface to a collection volume of Coleridge's poem, explaining and justifying his own style and practice in poetry. So in this work, he defines poetry as poetry is the best work in the best order. Poetry is the best words in the best order. The work grew to a literary autobiography covering his education and studies and his early literary adventures, and extended criticism of William Wordsworth's theory of poetry as given in the preface to the Lyrical Ballads, and a statement of his philosophical views. The next work is A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf. So it is an extended essay by Virginia Woolf which was first published in September 1929. The work is based on 2 lectures Woolf delivered in October 1928 at Newham College and Girton College, that is a women's college at the University of Cambridge. In her essay, Woolf uses metaphors to explore social injustices and comments on women's lack of free expression. Her metaphor of a fish explains her most essential point: a woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. She writes of a woman whose thought had let its line down into the stream. As the woman starts to think of an idea, a guard enforces a rule whereby women are not allowed to walk on the grass. Abiding by the rule, the woman loses her idea. Here, Woolf describes the influence of women's social expectations as mere domestic childbearers, ignorant and chaste. So in this work, we could see some fictional characters, like the narrator itself is a fictional narrator. Then we have Mary Satan, that is, she's a student at Fernham's College and a friend of the narrator. Then we have Mary Baton, the narrator's aunt. Then Mary Carmichael, that is a fictional novelist. And we have Judith Shakespeare, the imagined sister of William Shakespeare. The Beadle, we have the Beadle, an Oxbridge security official. Then the Manx cat, a cat the narrator sees on the lawn at Oxbridge. Its tail is missing. Then we have Mr. A. It is supposed that it is an imagined male author. Okay, so we have these references in this work. When the emergence of the new woman occurred, this awareness of injustice made a clear political statement regarding women's intellectual potential in their own right. Woolf suggests that the absence of female fiction is a result of a lack of opportunity rather than a distinct absence of talent. The association between poverty and low achievement can also lead to disadvantages for generations. The next work is The Tradition and the Individual Talent by T.S. Eliot. So this work was published in 1990 and later again it was published in 1920. In the first publication it was published in The Egoist and later it was published in The Sacred Wood. The essay is also available in Eliot's Selected Prose, Selected Essays. In this dual role, he acted as a cultural critic comparable to Sir Philip Sidney and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. This essay is divided into three parts. The first, concept of tradition, then the theory of impersonal poetry, and finally the conclusion about tradition. The next work is Archetypes of Literature by Northrop. Actually, this essay, Archetypes of Literature, is taken from the Fables of Identity, Studies in Poetic Mythology, a critical work which was published in 1963. In the essay, he analyzes literature against a backdrop of rituals and myths. This essay is divided into three parts. The first part deals with the concept of archetypal criticism. The second part throws light on the inductive method of analysis of a text, and the third part focuses on the deductive method of analysis. Here, Frye developed the archetypal approach into a radical and comprehensive revision of traditional grounds both in the theory of literature and the practice of literary criticism. The next work is The Language of Paradox by Cleanth Brookes. This essay was first published in 1942. The work was revised later and came as the preface of the well-wrought urn. Brookes posits that good poetry is ambiguous, ironical, and proceeds wonder. So language of poetry is the language of paradox, and language of poetry is intellectual and rational. In this essay, Cleanth Brookes emphasizes how the language of poetry is different from that of the sciences, claiming that he is interested in our seeing that the paradox springs from the very nature of the poet's language. It is a language in which the connotations play as great as part as the denotations. The next work is Marxism and Literature by Edmund Wilson. It was first published in 1938. It is the ninth essay in the collection, The Triple Thinkers, which reflects his disillusionment with Marxist literature. The essay begins by examining the role assigned to art and literature in Marxism. Marxism and literature celebrates Marxism's ability to throw a great deal of light on the origins and social significance of works of art, but attacks the belief then advocated by that good literature can be made from ideological formulas. The next work is Feminist Criticism in Wilderness by Elaine Showalter. It was first published in Critical Enquiry in 1981, and it is her first major work which lucidly presents the evaluation of feminist criticism. The essay is an attempt to study the field of literary criticism from the feminist point of view. And she has tried to study the various aspects of feminist criticism while also pointing out the aim it should be trying to attain, the problems it faces, and the reasons for these problems. The essay considers the fact that, like feminist creative writers, feminist critics also face certain obstacles which have got highlighted after the rise of feminism. Showalter has tried to analyze in detail the belief that feminist criticism is in wilderness, which means feminist critics are not capable enough to produce coherent speculations. The next work is Difference by Jacques Derrida. As you can read the work in which it appeared, you can read it from the slide. Anyway, I don't know, friends, so I couldn't read the title. So it was published in 1968. Derrida's remarks were delivered as a lecture at a meeting of the society in 1968. The essay was reprinted in Theory-Ensemble, a collection of essay by Derrida and other published by Editions Zool in 1968. Derrida first used the French term difference in his 1963 paper. You can read it from the slide. It is a central concept in Derrida's deconstruction, a critical outlook concerned with the relationship between text and meaning. The term difference means difference and differential of meaning. The term difference plays a key role in Derrida's engagement with the philosophy of Edmund Husserl in Speech and Phenomena. The next work is The Fetishism of Commodities and the Secret Thereof by Karl Marx. Very important work. The Fetishism of the Commodities and its Secret is the fourth and final session of the first chapter, Commodities in Capital, a critique of political economy, thus capital. The keystone of Marx's critique of the capitalist mode of production. So this fetishism is the worship of an object because it is believed to have magic powers. Fetishism in anthropology refers to the primitive belief that godly powers can inhere in inanimate things. Example in totem. Marx borrows this concept to make sense of what he terms commodity fetishism. As Marx explains, the commodity remains simple as long as it is tied to its use value. When a piece of wood is turned into a table through human labor, its use value is clear, and as a product, the table remains tied to its material use. However, as soon as the table emerges as a commodity, it changes into a thing which transcends sensuousness. The next work we have from the theory of Sigmund Freud, and we know that he is associated with psychoanalysis. Actually, this psychoanalytic criticism is a form of applied psychoanalysis, which is the interpretation of the psychoanalytical elements in literature. According to him, the source of all energy in human beings is libidinal energy or sexual energy. And he talks about psychosexual developmental stages, repression, Oedipal complex, three functional parts of mind, ego and superego, then consciousness, subconsciousness, unconsciousness, drive theory, eros and thanatos. Have a detailed prepare a detailed note on all these topics. It is very important. You can expect a question definitely from this part. The next, Modernity, an incomplete project by Jürgen Habermas. Habermas has the intellectual background of Frankfurt School of Social Thought. He is not only a social theorist but also a strong defender of modernity. The assaults made by postmodernists on modernists are very strongly countered by Habermas. Modernity is the child of enlightenment. It is anchored in reason and democracy, and therefore Habermas sees modernity as an unfinished project. It means that much more has to be done in the realm of modernity before thinking about the possibility of postmodern world. The next work is by Raymond Williams, The Tradition, Institution and Formation. So, Marxism and Literature, which was published in 1977, marked a major development in Williams' work as it represented his first thoroughgoing engagement with Marxism and thus with a number of important theoretical resources for cultural studies, including Althusser's conception of ideology and Gramsci's concept of hegemony. Williams is unhappy with the uniformity suggested by orthodox Marxist accounts of historical epochs. He argues rather that any moment in history must be analyzed in terms of the presence and interplay of dominant, residual, and emergent cultures. Very important. The Tradition, Institution, Formation is the seventh chapter of Marxism and Literature, which was published in 1977. The next work, Shakespeare and the Exorcist by Stephen Greenwald. Shakespeare and the Exorcist sees the presence of exorcism in Shakespeare as a part of deliberate attempt to demystify in religious terms, which ends up demystifying the aesthetic terms. In the essay, he mediates on the relationship between life, art, and theatricality in a sharp, defined cultural context. He develops a progressive relationship between religious ceremony and the theatre. Very important. He develops a progressive relationship between religious ceremony and the theatre. The ceremony here is exorcism and the theatre is Shakespeare's King Lear. The next work is two lectures given by Michel Foucault. He begins by outlining some of his research projects and moves to identifying an increasing vulnerability to criticism of things. So the main point to be gleaned from these events of the last 15 years, their predominant features is the local character of criticism. Foucault also identifies a return to knowledge that he defines as a fact that we have repeatedly encountered, an entire thematic to the effect it is not theory but life that matters, not knowledge but reality, not book but money. There is something else to which we are witness and which we might describe as an insurrection of subjugated knowledges. These subjugated knowledges, both erudite knowledge and popular knowledge, all deal with historical knowledge of struggles. This led to the emergence of a genealogical approach to research. Power or Knowledge is the collection of selected interviews and other works. It was translated into English by Colin Gordon, Leo Marshall, John Mayfan, and Kate Soper and edited by Colin Gordon. The two lectures comes as the fifth chapter of Power or Knowledge. It contains two lectures that were delivered in France by Foucault in 1976, which serves as an overview of Foucault's genealogical research. In the first lecture, there is an extended discussion of the nature of power. Power is examined as a construct of economy and asked whether or not this is not constraining. Power is not simply modeled on the commodity, but Foucault wonders how one can conduct a non-economic study of power. Power has been historically seen as a tool of repression. Repression no longer occupies the place that oppression occupies in relation to the contract. That is, it is not abuse, but is, on the contrary, the mere effect of the continuation of a relation of domination. In the second lecture, Foucault begins by examining the relations of power, truth, and right in the relation to one another like a triangle. My problem is what rules of right are implemented by the relation of power in the production of discourses of truth. There can be no possible exercise of power without a certain economy of discourse of truth which operates through and on the basis of the association. Foucault then moves on to the concept of sovereignty. He then promotes 5 different methodological precautions to his study, which he summarizes as follows. I would say that we should direct our research on the nature of power not towards the juridical edifice of sovereignty, but towards domination and the material operations of power, towards forms of subjugations and the inflections and utilizations of their localized systems, and towards strategic apparatuses. Next, Introduction to Orientalism by Edward Hsst. So, Orientalism is a 1978 book by Edward Hsst in which the author establishes the term Orientalism as a critical concept to describe the West's commonly contemptuous depiction and portrayal of the East, that is the Orient. Societies and peoples of the Orient are those who inhabit the place of Asia, North Africa, and the Middle East. Hsst argues that Orientalism in the sense of the Western scholarship about the Eastern world is inextricably tied to the imperialist society who produces it, and which makes much Orientalist work inherently political and servile to power. According to Hsst, in the Middle East, the social, economic, and cultural practices of the ruling Arab elites indicate they are imperial satraps who have internalized a romanticized version of Arab culture created by French, British, and later American Orientalists. Examples used in the book include critical analysis of the colonial literature of Joseph Conrad, which conflates a people, a time, and a place into one narrative of an incident and adventures in an exotic land. Through the critical application of post-structuralism in its scholarship, Orientalism influenced the development of literary theory, cultural criticism, and the field of Middle Eastern studies, especially with regard to how academics practice their intellectual inquiries when examining, describing, and explaining the Middle East. Moreover, the scope of Hsst's scholarship established Orientalism as a foundational text in the field of post-colonial studies by denoting and examining the connotations of Orientalism and the history of a given country's post-colonial period. The next work is The Laugh of Medusa by Helen Hsst. So it was originally written in French in 1975 and was translated into English in 1976. So in this essay, Hsst issues an ultimatum, that is, that women can either read and choose to stay trapped in their own bodies by a language that does not allow them to express themselves, or they can use the body as a way to communicate. She describes a writing style, that is, écriture feminine, that she says attempt to move outside of the conventional rules found in patriarchal system. She argues that écriture feminine allows women to address their needs by building strong self-narrative and identity. The text is situated in a history of feminist conversations that separated women in terms of their gender and women in terms of authorship. The Laugh of Medusa addresses this rhetoric, writing on individuality and commanding women to use writing and the body as a source of power and inspiration. Hsst uses the term the logic of anti-love to describe her understanding of the systematic oppression of women by patriarchal figures. She defines the logic of anti-love as the self-hatred women have made for women as an anti-Nazism. A Nazism which loves itself only to be loved by what women haven't got. This idea persecutes women by defining them by what misogynistic tradition believes make the female sex inferior. Hsst commands women to focus on individuality, particularly the individuality of the body, and to write to redefine self-identity in the context of her history and narrative. The essay includes the argument that writing is a tool women must use to advocate or for themselves in order to acquire the freedom women have historically been denied. The Laugh of Medusa is an exhortation and call for feminine mode of writing, which Hsst called white ink and écriture feminine. Hsst builds the text using the elements of this mode and fills it with literary allusions. She instructs women to use writing as a means of authority. Hsst explores how the female body is closely connected to female authorship. She conveys this message by employing a conversational dialogue in which she instructs her audience directly. She argues her audience to write using many direct conversational statements such as "Write is for you are for you, your body is yours, take it." Hsst's repetition in her message that women must write for themselves and claims her body bridges the gap between the physicality of the female body and their authorship. In doing so, she challenges the distinction between the theory and practice, expanding on the feminist rhetorical tradition. The work is successful in its creation of writing style that allows women to claim authority because it was created on the foundation of women's claim to herself and her body, therefore eliminating the oppressive effects of patriarchal control of rhetoric. This text is a critique of logocentrism and phallocentrism because it deprioritizes the masculine form of reason traditionally associated with rhetoric, having much in common with Jacques Derrida's earlier thought. In homage to French theorists of the feminine, Laugh with Medusa was published by Oxford University Press in 2006. The next work is The Epistemology of the Closet by Eve Sedgwick. So it is a book published in 1990 by Eve Sedgwick, who is considered one of the founders of queer studies or queer theory. The book tackles the question of what makes up human sexuality. In Epistemology of the Closet, Sedgwick states that standard binary oppositions limit freedom and understanding, especially in the context of sexuality. Sedgwick argues that limiting sexuality to homosexuality or heterosexuality in a structured binary opposition is too simplistic. The author analyzes a late 19th century historical moment in which sexual orientation became an important, a definer of personal identity as gender had been for centuries. In her preface, the author examines the book both personally and historically, as she analyzes the first wave of the AIDS epidemic and its influence on the text. Epistemology of the Closet focuses on literary works that reflect the social and political ideas of queer theorists. Some of the main authors that Sedgwick pulls from are Michel Foucault, Herman Melville, Oscar Wilde, Nietzsche, then Proust. So by this, we come to the end of today's presentation. Hope you have enjoyed the session. Thank you.